Hello everybody, welcome back to the third video in a series related to my lecture on April 7th. Where we left off, we were talking about this evidence-based policing matrix that was developed by researchers at George Mason University and their Center for Evidence-Based Crime Policy. And I was talking about this as being a resource for police agencies so that they can have a look at what the research evidence suggests is effective. So what I want to do now is focus on particular policing strategies that fall within what they refer to as a realm of effectiveness. Also, what I'm going to do is I'm going to set aside problem-oriented policing, which is included in this realm of effectiveness, and I'm going to focus on three particular types of policing that have a pretty solid evidence base, some with some qualifications, but where we have research evidence that suggests that police might be proactive if they implement these strategies. And they are hotspots policing, disorder-based policing, as well as focused deterrence interventions. So you've probably heard of hotspots policing before. Hotspots are considered geographic locations with an above average concentration of crime, and so hotspots policing pretty simply includes targeting those geographic locations that have above average concentrations of crime. So this is a policing tactic that has a great deal of evidence that suggests it can be effective. We've seen that a variety of tactics are found to be effective when they're focused in crime hotspots, things like vehicle patrol, foot patrol, short intermittent vehicle stops at hotspots of about 15 minutes, as well as offender-focused policing. So we've got a lot of different tactics that have been found to be effective when focused in hotspots. I should note that included in this group would be problem-oriented policing, and in fact the evidence suggests that when police take a problem-oriented approach at hotspots, that tends to be the most effective way that they can have an impact on crime. But as I mentioned, I'm going to be talking about problem-oriented policing a bit later in the semester, and so I'm going to set that aside for now and not discuss it in this particular lecture. But it's important to know that problem-oriented policing does have evidence to suggest it's effective, particularly particularly when focused in hotspots. So in terms of overall evidence, I mentioned what systematic reviews are, and they're essentially the studies of the studies. So in the most recent meta-analysis that came out in 2019, 62 of the 78 tests of hotspots policing reported noteworthy crime control gains. So in other words, these tests demonstrated that hotspots policing did in fact reduce crime. And again, this involved a number of different tactics that were introduced in hotspots of crime. Some important things to point out, though. I mentioned what a hotspot is in the second video as well, but when people think about high crime areas, they tend to think about large geographies. But with hotspots, we're talking about very small, micro-level geographic locations. As I mentioned, like street corners, street blocks, a single address, like a problematic bar, for example, or clusters of these locations. So it's important to note that police are effective when they focus on these very small geographies. When we think about police strategies that have been implemented at the neighborhood level, we tend to not see the benefits that we do when we focus on smaller geographies. So size is important when we're talking about hotspots policing. And of course, hotspots policing is not without its critics. So there are other things to consider when police agencies are thinking about adopting a hotspots policing approach. And the first one relates to, well, what exactly are we going to do in these hotspots? Are we simply going to go in and aggressively apply law enforcement tactics like stop and frisk and arrests? Well, if we do, we have to be cognizant of the fact that citizen reaction might not be too positive. So if we've got police who are simply going into neighborhoods and doing lots of stops and making lots of arrests, there's the potential that individuals who are stopped, the family and friends of those individuals, they're going to develop a negative impression of police. And I think this is or a good example of this occurring is in New York City, where if you followed policing in New York City, crime has trended down since the 1990s in New York, but there also has been quite a bit of community backlash in terms of what the NYPD has been doing. And the NYPD has taken a pretty spatially nuanced approach by targeting crime hotspots. So citizen reaction to hotspots policing tactics matter just as much as whether we're successful in reducing crime. So definitely something to consider. One of the common criticisms when we take a place-based approach is that crime isn't going to go away. We're not actually going to have an impact on crime. We're simply going to displace it or move it around the corner to a different geographic location, or offenders might begin committing crime at different times. There's all sorts of different types of displacement. And this has always been a criticism of place-based policing. If we turn to Braga et al.'s systematic review that was published in 2019, however, what they find is actually the complete opposite is true in most cases. Most often what's discovered is that there's a diffusion of crime control benefits. And what that is instead of seeing crime increase in the areas surrounding the geographies that police target, we actually see crime go down as well. So a diffusion of benefits seems to be the more likely outcome of place-based policing. But this nevertheless is a concern of particularly police practitioners and officers who are out doing the work. They believe that based on their experience, they're not having an impact on crime. Very often they're just moving people. Another thing to consider is problem-solving efforts appear to be the most effective in policing crime hotspots. So as police leaders decide upon their tactics, the evidence suggests that they might be better served by trying to work with the community to solve the underlying problems that contribute to crime rather than going in neighborhoods and being aggressive in law enforcement. And so hotspots policing, a whole lot of evidence that suggests that it's effective, but we really need to think through the approaches that we take in these hotspots.